The fear of the Lord is not developed in a crisis time. What was the difference between Joseph, we'll look at this morning, and David, we'll look at next week? What was the primary difference? The primary difference in those two men is one feared God. And he was aware that God saw him all the time. That's God's omnipresence. God was there. He was aware that God knew the situation of his life, his omniscience. He was aware of God's omnipotence, that the things didn't just happen to him, that he didn't just get tossed in a pit and dragged off by Ishmaelites and sold to Potiphar's house. He feared God. He was aware of God's presence, his watching, his holiness. David, however, had become desensitized to that, as we'll see next time. But a crisis doesn't make a man or a woman. It only reveals what they have all the time been becoming. Joseph was becoming a young man who feared God. What did that mean? Well, it means he'd entered into what Psalm 19 says is the divine condition. The divine condition is living life all the time, surrounded, pressed in by the reality that God is there, that God is watching, that God is listening, that God is actually participating if you're a believer. Remember that's what the Apostle Paul said to the Corinthians who had forgotten that. They were involved in immorality. The Apostle Paul said, don't you know that when you commit immorality, you join your body, which is God's holy temple, to a harlot? He says, don't do that. Don't you fear God? Don't you realize you're doing that? The divine condition is clean. Fearing God is lovingly acknowledging by my actions that you see me, God. The fear of the Lord kept Joseph pure even in the days of his youth, the days of our youth, which can sometimes be so hard. God had some big plans for Joseph. And Joseph might have forfeited it all for a moment of pleasure. But the fear of the Lord kept him. And the fear of the Lord can keep us. Well, how can we participate in the fear of the Lord this morning? Let me show you why we should before I show you how we can do it. Look at 1 Peter chapter 2. I know I always have my friends, and they say, oh, does that say that in the New Testament? You know, some people are under the bondage that only what's in the New Testament counts. And so for those people, I always find, of course, it is. And it says in 1 Peter, the Apostle Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 17, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God. Fear God. And honor the king or the president or whoever's in office. That's a real succinct, rounded way of life that Peter put. But we should, and the New Testament commands it, and the Old Testament commands it, and basically God commands that we fear him. When should we fear God? When should we fear God? Well, all the time. But when does it happen in our lives? Well, first of all, I think that we will come to fear God when we realize his omnipresence. Now, you're going to be turning a lot of pages, and some of you, you can just write them on the back of the notes section. But those of you that like to come with me, I'm going to start in Genesis, and I'm going to show you when we should fear God. Okay, now that we've established that the New Testament, as well as the Old Testament, says it. Genesis 39. Genesis 39 says the first time that we should fear God is when we come to realize that he is everywhere present, as Joseph did. And what I want you to do is I want you to go from the Potiphar's palace, or Potiphar's at least mansion, and go right to wherever it is that you spend your time and your life, and transport yourself from the fact that this was good for Joseph into whatever is the area of life you struggle with. Maybe you struggle late at night when everybody's asleep and you're watching TV with the remote. Maybe you struggle when you're on business trips and you're walking through airports and those shops are there. Or maybe you struggle when you go to the mall and you're already in debt and you've already got too much stuff, but you always get encouraged when you buy things. Or maybe you struggle every time you go buy food. I mean, I don't know just where your point of struggle is. It's either the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, or the pride of life. But wherever it is, the first step to fearing God is realizing what Joseph realized in Genesis 39, realizing God's omnipresence. God is everywhere present. This is what it says. And this is one of my favorite portions of the Bible. I've read it so many times. In fact, my children have a hobby. They underline the verses Daddy speaks about in church. Some of them, you can hardly see them. They underline them so many times. And they say, you already mentioned that. I said, I know. But Peter said, stir you up by way of remembrance. So I underline them often. This is a good verse. Genesis 39, look at verse 8. But he refused her advance and said to his master's wife, look, my master doesn't know what is with me in the house. And he has committed all that he has into my hand. And this doesn't just count with sexual things. This could be financial things. This could be a same response you have if you have trouble working or if you have trouble being accountable for finances, integrity. It doesn't matter. The same principle comes through in verse 9. There is no one greater in this house than I. He says, nobody's looking over my shoulder. And my master hasn't kept back anything from me but you, because you're his wife. Now here's the omnipresent God. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin? Not against Dad back in Canaan. Not against my brothers living in tents. Not against Pharaoh. Not against Potiphar. Not even against you, Potiphar's wife. See, the omnipresence of God is when we realize, as Joseph did, that all sin, whether what we would consider little, what we would consider secret or hidden or whatever no one will ever know, is always utterly against God. Ray Stedman was a fabulous Bible teacher. He used to carry Harry Ironsides, who was a tremendous Brethren Bible teacher's suitcases when Ironsides would travel. And Ray, this is many years ago at the turn of the century, but Ray Stedman studied the Bible after Ironsides' legacy came upon him. And I remember in his writings how he would say that what gripped him was when he realized that he was in the aquarium and God was on the outside, and he was like a fish with the backlit, lights over the top and the glass, and he was just in that clear water. And God had his face right up against the aquarium looking in all the time. And that means that wherever you are, whether it was out with someone you're not married to yet last night, or if it was on your business trip this week, or if it's in school in this coming week, that God's face is pressed against the glass of your life. And every single thing we do, and every single thing we think, and every single word that comes out of our mouth, and every motive that surfaces and prompts us to action, that all of those are as vividly portrayed as the graphics on my computer screen. It's in the face of God. You know what Joseph said? God, I'm not going to have moral impurity on my screen. I'm not going to do that. And it didn't bother him. And unlike a lot of other New Testament characters that didn't do things because they were afraid of getting caught, or they didn't do things because they were afraid of hurting their reputation or their inheritance, Joseph is a pure example of the fear of God because of God's omnipresence. He says, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? How much of the Bible did he have? None. None of it was written yet. It was still oral tradition at this time. God's Spirit had not moved on Moses to write the book of Job and to write the Pentateuch. It wasn't on paper yet. He had just heard about it from his dad. His dad had said, I wrestled with God one night up on the brook Yabbok. He said, I slept one night with my head on a rock and God opened heaven. And all those stories Jacob had passed on to Joseph, and Joseph said, thou art the God that sees me. You've got a Bible. Most of you have gone to Sunday school. Most of you have gone to church half your life or more. Most of you listen to the radio. Most of you read Christian books. We all have far more than Joseph had, but most of us don't fear God like he feared him. Most of us don't acknowledge God's omnipresence. We don't acknowledge that everything I do is in the face of God. The scriptural word is emprosthen, before the face of God. If you fear God, you don't do anything that he would not approve of. That's the divine condition.